Okay, so welcome everybody to CSS Part 3. We are going to be looking at some interesting topics today, or at least I think they're interesting anyway, and we'll look at some kind of fun things that you can do with CSS. Not loads and loads of fun things, but just enough to give you to kind of scratch that interest that I'm sure some of you have. So I will just take a sip of tea. I'll just show this. It's a Liverpool mug. The reason why I'm showing it is because I know that we have some football or soccer fans in attendance, and I know some of you support some different teams. So I just thought I would show you my colors. Okay, so we will load up the presentation, and then of course we will be looking at some code though as well, which I'm sure you'll be happy to hear. So let me just switch to the keynote. Okay, and let's just move this over here. Okay, so CSS Part 3. Just to clarify as well, can everybody hear me okay? Okay, that's amazing. Glad to hear it. Okay. So, CSS. So today, we're going to be looking at some CSS methodologies. Another way of looking at that or referring to that is kind of some ideas or approaches that you can take to organizing the CSS that you write. We'll also briefly just touch upon kind of libraries and frameworks as well. And then we've got the bit that we've just called fun stuff. So I won't reveal too much about what we're looking at in that moment for now. Okay, CSS methodologies. Well, as your website grows in complexity, so does the complexity of your CSS. And as you begin to build more complex websites and applications, you need to know how to approach code in a way that is modular, reusable, and scalable. Failing to do so often can result in something known as spaghetti code. And the thing is, although people often think of this with regards to things like JavaScript and just your general programming languages, the same can happen with CSS as well. So over the years, CSS methodologies have been devised and put to use, and we'll take a look at some of the more popular methodologies, and hopefully you can get hopefully in doing so, you can make a decision over which ones sound better to you. But I just want to make it clear as well that while each methodology arguably has its own pros and cons, a lot of this is subjective. Now, there may be occasions where you're working on a team and it's important that the code you write adheres to the standards set by the team. So, there may be occasions where you're required to write CSS with a particular methodology. But for now, and while you're working on your own projects, it's important that you pick whatever methodology feels comfortable to you. The key thing that I want to stress is maintaining consistency throughout your project. So if you begin to use a methodology, but you start to veer away from it during your project, you run the risk of creating spaghetti code. So just some things that I want you to bear in mind. We'll stick on this one for the moment. In fact, we'll just go to that. So another term that we can use instead of spaghetti code is technical debt. Some of you may have heard this word before. Either way, the more you spend time thinking about how to best avoid spaghetti code in the beginning, the less of a problem it will become as your projects grow. I can just see there's some questions coming through, or maybe from Arutharan. So is 200 plus lines complex? Well, it depends. It really does depend on what you're doing. I mean, I would say 200 lines of CSS in one file could start to get complex if you're not tackling it as soon as you can. So just to touch on this word that I used before, technical debt. Now, when you're, this is something that a lot of startups have to deal with as well. When you're, but in the case of, say, any of the homework that you're doing, as you start to write the CSS and the HTML, if you approach it without a framework, and by framework I don't mean like a CSS framework or a JavaScript framework, but I just mean like a proper strict approach to writing the CSS or HTML or JavaScript or whatever. If you approach it without a plan, you run the risk of creating problems as the project grows. And you might find that you return to a project 6 months later, and it's just it's just one big mess, and it becomes really difficult for you to update the code and even just understand what the code is. Ibrahim mentions, if you add useful comments, you'll make it easier for yourself in navigating large files. I agree. That's what comments should be used for, to assist you as the human, as the reader, in understanding what the code is. But yes, I mean, that's definitely one thing. But there are methodologies and things that we can do to improve this. So now, in fact, I'll go to that page in a moment. So one of the questions that people might have is, why do we even need the CSS methodologies? What's the importance of them? I mean, I've kind of mentioned about reducing spaghetti code, but for anybody who's new to CSS, you might still not really understand what the purpose or use of it is. Well, some of you may know that there are these things called CSS preprocessors, such as Sass, which is probably the most well-known. Now, these do things that help with reducing some of the issues that people have when writing CSS. But with large projects, one of the issues that people have is something known as specificity and managing that within CSS. Now, we've not really touched on this before, but if you were to create a CSS class and a CSS ID, bear in mind, for anyone who cannot remember, an ID is when you use the hash symbol or hashtag or pound symbol, and classes are when you use the period or full stop. You could write the exact same thing as a class and an ID, and the ID is going to have a higher specificity rating than the class, which means that if you use both of them, the ID is going to overwrite the class. This might sound a little bit strange, but let's just kind of try and look at it like this. I mean, as some of you will know, there are plenty of different ways that you can apply styles. I've seen this in some of your homeworks where maybe you've just applied a class or applied styles to the element. Maybe you've done it to the class. Maybe you've done it to an ID. Maybe you've done kind of like a nested styling where you've, if you look at, say, the fifth one on the list where it says ULLI, so that would be targeting just list elements that are inside an unordered list. And ultimately, they actually have these specificity ratings, and it's what you can see on the right-hand side where it says result. So ultimately, if you have competing styles, whichever one has the highest result is the one that will get applied. If you have a specific CSS methodology for this, it's going to reduce or eliminate, if you do it well, the need for you to even have to care about specificity, because you'll always be writing styles that will target exactly what you want them to. So let's kind of get a bit of the some of that kind of boring stuff out of the way. Now let's actually look at some. But I mean, here's just here's an example of just some CSS. Now, I imagine some of you have been writing CSS in a similar fashion to this. What this is this is a person. This is not an example from any of your homework, by the way. This is just something I've made up. But this would look like an approach someone may have taken where they are just creating HTML elements as they go on, and then they're just applying styles as they go on without any real structure. And if you look at what we've got here, we've not really got any consistency with what we're doing. I mean, we've got this container at the top, and then further down, we've got this kind of margin bottom, but then we've got margin bottom container. Then we've got things like small container. Then we've got container SM, which is short for small. We've got button. We've got BTN. We've got BTN small, BTN MED, and so on. And it's ultimately just a really bad way to approach writing CSS. Because if you're making a really small one-page website that you never have any intention of updating once you've kind of put it on the internet, then okay, you'll get away with it. But if you're working on anything complex with people, then you're going to run the risk of just creating some really bad code. So bear that in mind. Okay. Gosh, and then here's some more stuff I've just written. But yeah, so I imagine some of you are writing CSS like this at the moment as well. This is probably a little bit of a better example where maybe you've created a container and then you've just applied a bunch of styles inside the container. Now, this is not a bad thing. I just want to make that clear. It's like this example is not bad. But it's not necessarily the only way that you could write CSS. This actually would be something maybe akin to something called object-oriented CSS, which we'll take a look at in a moment. But the first CSS methodology I want us to look at is something known as atomic CSS. Now, for anybody who has some experience with CSS, and I know there are some of you in the room who may have used things such as Tailwind. Tailwind is refers to itself as utility-first CSS, but it actually originated as atomic CSS. So in other words, what Tailwind is doing is not a new concept. It's an old concept that's been repackaged with a new name. What is atomic CSS? Well, atomic CSS, in a nutshell, is basically an approach to create a class selector for every repeating CSS declaration. So atomic CSS encourages developers to define single-purpose class selectors for every reusable declaration. One of the main benefits of using atomic CSS is the ease of maintaining consistent code and not having to invent classes for components where they maybe only require a single rule. However, atomic CSS can lead to an unmanageable number of classes and a bloated HTML file. So let me show you an example of what atomic CSS is, because I know that without it, that can just sound a bit strange. So just bear with me one moment. I'm just going to load up a code pen, and then I can show you some code. In fact, bear this in mind. Let me just show you some CSS written without any kind of methodology or anything. So just kind of writing on the fly as you go on. So let me share a different screen. Hello again, everybody. Okay. So we've got that. Let me just see some of the questions that you've got, actually, because I do want to try and answer some of them in the moment rather than leaving them all to the end. So, okay, what kind of scale are the results in? Ones, threes, tens, and then thousands. So ACS, it's actually in neither really. It's just numeric from 1 upwards incrementally with figures of 1. It's just, they were some examples really. So if you had all of those specificities, then that would be the number for each one. But there isn't a scale as such in what you're looking at, as in ones, threes, tens, and thousands. It's really just kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and so on. So Ibrahim, yeah, those buttons, yeah, they were terrible indeed. Bloated HTML will result in slow loading. That's a good question. Not necessarily. I mean, it can. I mean, naturally, the bigger a file is, the longer it will take to load, because there is more information to download. If you imagine that every single letter is 1 byte, if you think of it like that, then the more letters, the more bytes. And if you're using really long declarations for classes, then yes, you would run that risk. But nowadays, at least for most, at least in many countries, that shouldn't really be too much of an issue. So let me just see what Ibrahim's put as well. So instead of styling elements of HTML individually, you prepare the styles so that they may be reusable in the future. Yeah, exactly. That's it. So let me just show you this. So as I said, this is without any kind of methodology as such. This is just what I wrote. So we've got 3 buttons here. You can see the classes we've got here as well. So we've got 3 buttons. 2 of them have these classes. And then inside our CSS, we've got this kind of main block of CSS that we're using for a button. And then we've just got 2 additional classes of warning and success. And then here we apply them to those 2. So that's not atomic CSS. Like I said, that's just some regular, me writing just some plain old CSS without any kind of real methodology. So let's take a look at how this would be if we were doing atomic CSS. Well, the first thing is we would want to remove a lot of these things and make them reusable where possible. So for example, this border radius 10, it might be that I don't have that on the button, but I give it its own class. It could be border radius 10. It could be something like that. Or maybe I'd make it a bit shorter and do something like BR for border radius 10. And then what I would do is put that on each button. So instead of me just doing that all, here's one I created earlier. And then we'll just talk about what we're looking at. So you'll see here we've achieved the exact same thing, but the first thing you'll notice is that our button, the HTML is a lot more verbose. The reason for that is because we've completely split this up. Just before I answer that, so Jean said, "Isn't Bootstrap atomic CSS?" Yeah, more or less. It definitely takes a lot of its influence from there. Yeah, that's definitely a good example, Jean. Yeah, if we look at this, we've got this button that all of a sudden just has a height, a width, and a cursor on it. But then we're creating these kind of reusable styles here. So we've got padding or PH, which, look, you can call these whatever you want. I've just put PHs in padding horizontal. Yeah, as in the, well, maybe it's not horizontal. Maybe it should have been vertical. In fact, yeah, that's completely wrong. It should be the other way around. So as in the horizontal lines on the top and bottom. Anyway, and then we've we've effectively taken all of those styles and split them out separately so that we could then start to use these again. So let's say I created a div for some reason, and let's just put academic squad. So if we had something like that, then all of a sudden we could start to use these classes here as well. So say if I want to use this BG, this background red, I can just do BG-red on there. And then we can just start to reuse the same classes over and over again. So this is one approach to your CSS. So let's just, oh wait, I think I've tried to raise my hand on here, which is silly. So let's just switch back to our presentation for a moment. Does anyone have any questions about that at the moment, or did that make sense? Okay. That's cool. Okay, so I'm glad to hear it. And of course, bear in mind that, you know, we've just looked at 3 buttons. We've not looked at an entire website, but the idea is that you could just reuse them throughout your website. Okay, yeah, so that's that. So the next thing I wanted to take a look at, okay, let me just check something. Let me just read these questions. So Hafiz trying to understand first. Yeah, that's fine. That makes sense. Aruthan, on all the CSS frameworks, atomic CSS? Not to my knowledge, no. They all take, lots of them take different approaches. If they're rooted in creating helper classes, which things like Bootstrap are, then yes, they do atomic CSS. SAS and less and things like that, they are not frameworks that apply a methodology. That's not what they enable some features of certain methodologies. For example, there's one called SMAX, which is scalable modular something CSS. Those kind of there are things like that, but no, SAS and less are not atomic CSS frameworks. So bear in mind when we're looking at these things such as atomic CSS, object-oriented CSS, and so on, these are methodologies, so they're not frameworks. Okay, there is a clear distinction between them, at least in technical terms when we're looking at programming and things like that. We won't really go into that too much now, though. Okay, so the next methodology is object-oriented CSS. Object-oriented CSS is a programming paradigm, and it's best understood in the context of kind of object-oriented programming, really. Classic CSS, which is just general CSS, which is basically like spaghetti CSS, is how can I put this? It's a bit like a procedural code, in which case you just write it as you go on, whereas taking an approach such as object-oriented CSS focuses on creating flexible, modular, swappable components that, in inverted commas, do one thing well. So it focuses on some of these kind of programming paradigms that you'll come across more as you kind of develop as a programmer, no pun intended. So things such as single responsibility principle, separation of concerns, and things like that. So let's take a look at some, and you'll understand it a bit better. So let's switch back to my face and then switch to our our pen. Okay, Ibrahim, I'm really glad to hear that, because it is important. I wish someone had done this with me before. Do you know what? In fact, to some extent, what we wrote before, the very first approach I took, was in fact a type of object-oriented CSS. Now, the nice thing is, of course, I mean, I probably should have wrote this first example worse, the first example I gave, but I guess because of just because I've been writing it for so long that I kind of ended up writing good CSS by accident. And what I mean by this is, if you think of, for anyone who's not too aware of what object-oriented programming is the idea that you create these kind of isolated environments for specific things. So if we were, let's say we were building some software and we needed to design a car, and we were making a car that could drive and things like that, we may create an object that is a representation of a car. And then it may have some additional features and things like that, like a motor, wheels, and so on. But you would create this isolated car or chunk of code for a car that you could just reuse over and over and over again. So if you needed to create a new car, you would just reinstantiate that block of code that you made before. So object-oriented CSS is no different. Let me take a sip of my tea and then I'll explain it. Okay, so yeah, I mean, Ibrahim's put a chunk of code in there. But I'll just explain it with what we've got on the screen. So the reason why this is object-oriented CSS is because we're creating buttons, and we've created CSS that is specifically a button. It's called a button as well. And then we've got these warnings and success that we attach on. But the important thing is this: if we just focus on this, then that's exactly an object. If we were creating a form, chances are, whatever the classes would be things to do with form. And it might be that inside of it, we've got inputs. And this may be something such as input and so on. So it's effectively writing CSS that are isolated for specific objects. And then, yeah, I mean, if we look at what Ibrahim's put in the chat, for anyone who can see that, the CSS is, I mean, I'll just copy it over, in fact, so you can all see it, or at least anybody who's watching this back can see it. So we'll ignore what we've got there, but you'll see that the CSS is specific to what it is targeting. So in this case, there's a button. In this case, there's a box. Here's a widget. Here is skin, and so on. Rather than what you might have with, say, atomic CSS, which is things like margin bottom, where it's like margin bottom 10 pixels. So something like that is not object-oriented CSS, but is rather atomic CSS, because this is not an object. This is not a representation of something. This is just a helper class or a utility. So hopefully that makes sense. Let me just mute everyone because I could hear some random noise all of a sudden. So, so far, does that make sense to everyone? And if not, please let me know. Okay, cool. So yeah, interesting. Ax, you're saying you much prefer that approach. That's all good. Neither approach is the right solution. It's just they all have their own pros and cons. So, but I really like that you're even able to have an opinion already just from looking at two. So that's cool. And like I said, the most important thing is consistency. So don't just start mixing them without any kind of rhyme or reason. It's not to say you can't mix them though. It's just have a structured approach in mind if you're going to do it. So we will just switch again. So you'll see my face for a moment. How is everybody doing as well? Is everybody, is this kind of blowing anyone's mind, or is everyone okay? Yeah, I know it can take a while, definitely. Yeah, Ibrahim, I know it's interesting, isn't it? Every tutorial, at least you've seen, especially from what you've seen so far in the first two, shows you in one way. And I mean, you know, some of these things you could teach them in any order, but I think it's important for you to, as developers, to grow and kind of like accept that you sometimes make mistakes, and it's okay. And to be fair, it's not even a mistake. It's just learning better ways to do something. So in fact, let me take a sip of water as well. I've just been drinking tea so far. Whereas I know I'm apparently well known for drinking water on the job. So, okay, the next one we're looking at is known as BEM, or Block Element Modifier. Okay, so this is a specific this is like a form of object-oriented CSS, but it's very strict. It's got a strict naming convention for things. So you know, we've seen maybe a classical version of this, whereas BEM is an implementation of object-oriented CSS. So Ibrahim's just making me laugh in the comments. Okay, let's okay, essentially with BEM, you start with a block, which is the object name. So as you saw before with button, container, and things like that, you still have that. But then if you have children of that block, then you create, they have their own CSS, which follows a specific naming convention. And then if you have modifiers, they themselves have a naming convention. So let me not say any more and just show you an example, because it will make a lot more sense. So we're going to switch again. There needs to be a better way to do this. Or maybe we just need to get some better software. Okay. Right, so let's take a look at our CSS. Now, you will see, again, you know, we've achieved the same thing. But if we take a look at these classes, they're a little bit different looking here. Before, you may remember, we just had things like button, warning, button, success. Whereas now what we're doing is attaching button and then 2 hyphens, warning. And we're doing the same with success. And you'll see the CSS we've written is the same, but the naming convention slightly adjusted. So bear in mind, this is what we're doing. Okay, so let's imagine that we've got, okay, let's just imagine we've got this. Okay, and then inside of it, let's just put a H1. Oops. Okay, academic squad are the best. Okay, so yeah, so let's imagine we've got this. Now, this is our object, or the block, so that's fine. Okay, and then if we wanted to target this H1, now this is an element inside of our block. So let me just let me just put a comment here. So block equals container. Then let's do another comment here. Element equals we'll call this title, and then here we would call this container underscore title. Okay, and that's how we target it. This is an element. Okay, if we had a modifier, so let's okay, let's just grab that again. And in fact, we don't need to do that one again because we've got some here. So you'll see here, button -- warning is the button is the block, and then warning is a modifier because we're modifying our button. So yes, that's how you write it. So button is the block, and then because we're modifying it, we put -- warning. So hopefully that makes sense. And you can mix and match these as long as everything always starts with a block. So you could have block element modifier, in which case, you know, it might be something like this. And likewise, you know, you can just have it like that, and so on. So it's all all BEM really is a different way of writing object-oriented CSS. And again, each to their own. I mean, I personally am not a big fan of this type of writing because I think it looks ugly, but it does a good job. It does the same job really as object-oriented CSS. And yeah, Axe, as you say, you mentioned that you don't think it's very readable. I feel the same way, but I at least wanted to show it you as an approach, because there are, I've definitely seen some libraries in my time that use it. And you know, if you ever work in a project with anyone else who has maybe been, you know, maybe a project that's a few years old or something, you may end up coming across instances where you see this kind of code. So it's important to at least have an understanding of it. Okay, let's switch screen again. And you'll be pleased to hear that we're not looking at any more CSS methodologies now. I think that's enough for you to at least kind of get used to. So, okay. Let me just skip some stuff. In fact, let's just go back one. So, yeah, I guess I just wanted to say as well that, you know, with CSS, I mean, look, we've been writing CSS for around 25 years, and all of these methodologies that we've looked at have arrived in the last 15 or so years. And in the case of something such as utility-first, which is, in other words, atomic CSS, that gained more popularity in the past few years, but ultimately is just something repackaged with a new name. And it's likely that there will be new methodologies and approaches to writing CSS in the future. Not definitely, but someone may come up with a new approach that a lot of people like, and it gains traction and becomes popular. So, you know, as mentioned before, programming languages are not static. You know, they continue to evolve, just like the languages that we use for communication do. And CSS is no different in that regard. So while new methodologies emerge, you need to ensure that you stay on top of them, because new things are added all the time. Okay, so let me just see some questions. Raphael, what methodology do I use or recommend? It's more often than not, I find myself writing object-oriented CSS. Anybody who spends any time on Twitter will see that this utility-first approach is gaining a lot of traction, and people are really passionate about it. I like it to some extent. I don't mind it for certain things like helper functions. So I'm probably somewhere between atomic CSS and object-oriented CSS. But things like BEM, I don't use. And I mentioned before, there's SMAX, which is scalable and modular architecture for CSS. I was going to talk about it, and I started to look at it, and I just thought, do you know what? I really do not like this approach, and I don't want to spend time teaching it you because I don't think you'll like it either. But there are other approaches to look at as well. Okay, so actually, let me just touch on this as well. So, because I said I would talk about technologies and frameworks as well. So some of you will have heard of some of these things like Bootstrap, Tailwind, Sass, some of those classless libraries as well that were mentioned in our previous talk. There are a lot of these things out there, and I think anyone who spends any time on Twitter as well will see people talk about how maybe they write code with HTML, Tailwind, CSS, and React, or something like that. And if you're an experienced developer, fine, that's okay. But if you're new to something and you're new to a technology, which for the most part, the majority of you are, I would not recommend going anywhere near any of these CSS technologies or frameworks such as Sass, Less, or technologies like Bootstrap and Tailwind, or libraries, I should say, because you need to spend time getting good at CSS. So you need to have 10 or 15 websites under your belt that you've done well with just writing regular CSS. And once you get to that point, then you can start to look at these other technologies that will make your life easier in the long run. But if you start using them from the beginning, you'll just miss the opportunity to learn so much. I know I did that as well in the beginning when I started to learn CSS, and I just started using Bootstrap, and I had no idea what any of those classes did, or hardly any idea, and it just made my life more difficult when I actually got my first job, and I was told that I couldn't use any of those technologies. It was a slap in the face in that moment in time, and I don't want you to make that same mistake. As Ibrahim says, learn to walk before you try to run a marathon. Exactly. And how do you choose what convention to follow? Well, it's, again, as mentioned, it's whatever you prefer. Like, try something, stick to it, and if you like it, then use it in the next project and use it in the next one. Or if you're feeling, if you've got the courage, then create one website with one approach, and then create the next website with a different approach, and you'll learn yourself which ones you prefer. But as mentioned, if you're working in a team, say if you join a company, then you should use whatever approach they are already using. Otherwise, you'll piss some people off if you start writing stuff that's completely different to what they're doing. Okay, so and then that's basically just what I said already. Don't use these until you're proficient with writing regular CSS, which you may have heard as plain CSS or vanilla CSS. Okay, so some fun stuff. So as I mentioned, CSS evolves and new things get added all the time. So let's take a look at some of them. Okay. So the first thing I just wanted to look at was filters. Now, this is not necessarily something that you'll use a lot, but I think it's pretty cool. So I wanted to show you it. Let me just load some stuff up. Okay. So the filter CSS property applies graphical effects like blur or color shift or whatever to an element. And filters are commonly used to adjust the rendering of images, backgrounds, borders, things like that. Oh, wait, where have I gone? So they're included in the CSS standard, which basically just means you can use them. And there are several functions that exist that you can use. So here is a big list of some filters. But I understand that this might not make any sense at the moment. So let's take a look at them. All right, so you will see my face again as we shift page. Okay. Right, okay, so we've got this picture, which is just my profile picture from Twitter. So let's take a look at some of the things that we can do. So now I know you can see a bunch of them already here, but one thing that we could do is apply a blur to the image. And blur, or the blur function, applies a Gaussian blur to the image. So we could do something like that. And just like that, it's applied a blur to the image, just to make sure you can see that better in the on the screen. Yeah, you can just start to blur it like that. And there's lots of different types of values that you can apply to it. So we've done 20 pixels there. Let's do 50%. See if that works. Doesn't. What about 50M? Oh, okay, so it's blurred so much you can't even see it anymore. There we go. So 5M, things like that. So if you ever needed to blur something, then you can do it. So a reference says he's done the blur filter in C. Well, this allows you to do it in CSS with just one line of code, as you can see there. So there are lots of different things we can do. In fact, I won't even spend too much time just reading each one. I'll just show you each one and you can understand from that. So we could do something like drop shadow. And you can see here that all of a sudden it applies this massive shadow to the picture. Maybe we can change that to red and it will do red, or maybe we could pass in a hex value. So blue is 0000FF. So yeah, you can do all sorts of things like that. If we wanted to make the image gray, we could do so by putting grayscale on it. Maybe we don't want it to be completely gray, so we could do something like that, and it starts to bring some color back. We could change the hue completely, and it would make something like that. Or we could keep going, maybe 180 degrees or to 70 degrees and things like that. For any of you who know about keyframes as well, you can do animations. So you could theoretically make an animation that just keeps changing the hue, for example. Yeah, Hafiz, I noticed you tried it as well. So yeah, I mean, you could use things like filters in those keyframes to make animations. If you wanted to make the opacity different, you could. We could do 90 and then it's 10, and then you can see it's almost disappeared. What about inverting the color completely? You could do that. What if we did it to 200? Would it go back to normal? Nope. So 100 would be the maximum. If we wanted to make it sepia, we could. Sepia, or is it sepia? I hope it's sepia. If we wanted to change the contrast, we could. We could really turn this up as well. So 895%. And you can see it really just starts to go crazy. What about 1,500%? What about 5,000%? It's changing, but not that much because it's so high already. Brightness, we could do things like that. That's not really changed much. In this case, 100 is just normal. So if I went to 50, then it's going to get darker. Whereas if I went to 200, then it's going to get really light. Contrast is like deep frying the image. Yeah, I agree. And the nice thing is you can actually combine them as well, just by writing them like this. So inverting it, and then I could turn the contrast up to 5,000. Maybe we could do something like hue rotate 270. So you can basically just have a lot of fun with it. What's the difference between opacity 0.75 and fill to 75%? Which is better? That's an interesting question. I mean, they're both the same, really. So I mean, let's try them on here. So if you did 1 for opacity, then you get that. If you do 0.75, then you get that. If you do 75%, then you get that. So you get the exact same thing. In the case of things like that, there's no real difference. It's just really whatever you prefer, whether you want to use the decimal system or a percent system. So they're both fine. So let's have a look. Am I right? The filter property affects all inner elements residing inside the element we have applied the filter to. Yeah, I believe you're correct with that. So let's try it. Okay, so let's do that, and then let's change that to div. Let's put background red. So yeah, you can see here it's applying the filter to everything inside there. So if we did hue rotate, in fact, maybe that's not the best example. Let's make the text color red. Oh wow, it's really. Let's try and invert it now. Oh wait, that's silly of me. Having the background and the color the same thing. Yeah, so you can see here it modifies everything inside of it. And then, yeah, so what do you think about an online JavaScript image editor? Is it possible to use only CSS filters? Well, no, I think it's a good idea. Like Ibrahim says as well, it's an interesting idea. It could be something that you try working on as one of your projects, maybe in the future. But yeah, you could definitely do something like this. And theoretically, you should be able to apply a filter and then save the image or upload it somewhere. So yeah, you could definitely do something like that. And it sounds like a good idea. So those are some CSS filters. Now I've got a couple other fun things I want to show you. One of them, in my opinion, is really important. Like it's a real game changer for CSS. So I definitely don't want to not tell you about it. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about is custom properties. Some of you may have heard of this as CSS variables. Now, these are entities defined by CSS authors, or in other words, people such as yourself writing CSS, that contain specific values that can be used throughout a document. And they're set using custom property notation. So yeah, CSS variables or custom properties allow you to store a value in one place, but then use it in multiple other places. And typically we do it through this. So if you think about this, like if, let's say you had the text color of black, and you find yourself using it throughout your CSS. So let's say you've got thousands of lines of code, and every time you're applying a color to some text, you end up putting something like color black and so on. Well, what you could do is actually create a variable in this root element here that you can see, which I know isn't going to be new to some of you. And you could do something like storing the value there, and then you could just use it throughout your document. Let me show you an example, and then I think you'll really find it interesting how how variables enable us to be able to do something really cool. So ignore the ignore the stuff that you can see on the screen still. Let me get rid of this. Okay, so let's imagine that we've got this. Now bear with me a moment. Let me load up the CSS first. Is it possible to use variables across different documents? Yes, if you have multiple CSS files, as long as you load them in the correct order, then yes, you could use them anywhere. So let's imagine we've got this here. So Sunil's super blog. Now, what I want to point out is this here, this root in the CSS. Now, you don't have to create variables in the root. You can theoretically create them in here, for example, but the best practice is to put them in root. Now, what we're doing is this is almost like creating a theme for your website. So, okay, well, I want my background color to be white. I want the text color to be black. And this is almost like me trying to create a media query that I've just put here. So width tablet. So now whenever I want to reference, say, the tablet width or the background color or the text color, rather than me having to remember these values, because, okay, I put white and black, but you could be really specific and have like a specific color. You can just start to reference it like this. And when you want to reference them, you always use var, which is kind of short for variable. And then you have some curly braces, and then you just use the value there, or the property, I should say. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, you can see here for all these H elements, I've got text color here, text color here, text color here. Now, if I wanted to update the color for all of these, rather than me having to grab every single one and change it, I can just do it up here. So I can just put red, and then it changes it everywhere. And then when you're doing things like media queries, sometimes you might not remember what the width was, and you have to start scrolling through your document to find it. So so that you're being consistent. Well, now what we could do is just use that every single time when we want to target certain things. So you can see here in main, I put max width, and I've just put that there. That's not a media query, but that's just an example of me using it. So if I wanted to change the max width for the entire website, I could just write it there, and it's going to do it everywhere. So there's that, and that opens up something really cool that we can do. I won't switch back to the presentation. I'll just show you and talk about it. So now that we've got these variables here, this means we can do things like create dark mode and light mode for our website. And you can do it in a really easy way. So we've got that code there. Let me just put that in. So in fact, we haven't even changed anything there. Now I've written a little bit of JavaScript, JS, which I'll touch upon, but I just want to explain. I just want to show you something first as well. So you'll see here we've got this little button that I've just created. It's not the best button, but it's just to demonstrate the point that when I click on this, it just switches the website into dark mode. If I press it again, it goes into light mode. So all of a sudden, just by using these, I've been able to create this dark and light mode toggle. And the reason why this is doing that is because all I'm doing is I've got this little function here. And look, you'll learn more about JavaScript in the next module. So if anything, this is just a teaser as to like the kind of things that you can do with JavaScript. But all we're doing here is changing the property of text color here. So this text color in root, which is set to black, I'm saying, okay, well, if dark mode is active, then I want you to change the color. If it's not active, I want you to change it to that. So So yeah, all we're doing is just changing the values, and it just quite easily creates something like this. So CSS variables, I absolutely love them. They're one of my favorite things about CSS, and they didn't always exist until recently. Before, you had to use frameworks such as Sass to be able to create variables in CSS, whereas now it's just native. It's part of the specification. One thing I just wanted to show you as well is a website called Can I Use? Now, this is really good when it comes to knowing what level of support something has. So if we put, what is it, CSS variables? Can we put that here? So yeah, there's custom properties here, and you'll see that pretty much for most browsers, you can just use it now. Global usage is almost 95%. So the only people who wouldn't get that experience would be people using Internet Explorer, people maybe using Opera Mini, or these really old browsers here as well. So for the most part, you can use it. And I just wanted to show you this website. It's called caniuse.com, because if there are any kind of advanced or new features, it's worth checking them on this website to see how well supported they are. So let me just switch back and load up the presentation again. So let me just see the questions. So Axis says, can you create your own pseudo classes or declare your own variables? Well, sorry, I was in the middle of sipping water, and then I was about to burp to make sure I didn't. Well, those variables that we've shown you, they are variables. They're your own variables. As to whether you can create your own pseudo classes, I think there is actually a possibility. I can't remember for definite, but I know there are some new things coming in CSS that are in the works, and some of it is the ability to create your own states. So yes, I guess there would be things like pseudo classes. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you just start using them now, because the support wouldn't be that good. When we say support, it means that some browsers, you might write code that just doesn't work. It doesn't do what you wanted it to. But yeah, I mean, there are things like being able to create your own pseudo classes or state on elements is something that's in the works. There's loads of cool stuff that will come to CSS in the coming year. We just have to wait for it to happen. So one thing I just wanted to say before we end this lesson is this, really. It's just, and it's kind of what I prefaced before we started recording as well, is that there's just simply too much CSS to try and cover in just 3 lessons. So your CSS education doesn't, and it shouldn't end here. So I'm just laughing at what Axe is saying. Said he wants his money back. So yes, just bear this in mind, okay? That I've looked at these last 3 lessons as a duty to introduce you to as much as I can in the time given, but there's still so much more to learn. So just keep researching, keep trying, keep just testing things and seeing what works. It's the best way to learn. And at the very least, if you want further reading, then just go on mdn.org or Mozilla Docs. They're much better than things like W3 Schools, and we'll just fill in some of the gaps maybe that have been left by myself. So in summary, as we get to the end of the web development basics module, there are many CSS methodologies, each with their own pros and cons. Atomic CSS allows you is based on creating a class selector for every repeating CSS declaration. As mentioned, another way of referring to atomic CSS is utility first. Object-oriented CSS divides layouts into objects, then abstracts the CSS into modules. BEM, or block element modifier, uses a standard naming convention for classes and is a variant of object-oriented CSS. And whatever you choose, just ensure you stay consistent throughout the project. Lots of new features get added to CSS. One of them is the ability to easily apply filters on elements, such as images. Custom properties enable the possibility to create variable values within CSS. And this opens up a lot of possibilities for drying up your code and makes cool features easier, such as light dark mode. For anyone unaware, dry is short for do not repeat yourself, or don't repeat yourself. Yeah, that brings us to the end of this module. So I hope at the very least this has been interesting and piqued your curiosity in relation to HTML, writing semantic HTML, improving accessibility, and then all of the various things that we've spoken about with regard to CSS. So different ways to create layouts, some best practices, lots of different methodologies, and then just various fun things that you can do as well. So yeah, thank you everyone for being a part of this so far. I hope that Piero will continue your learning experience a week and a half from now, or maybe not a week and a half, in 2 weeks from now. So I will just stop this recording and then we will go into a small Q&A session if anybody has one. Okay. In fact, do you know what? We'll just keep going. So there's no reason to stop the recording because I've realized that these videos actually just continue recording beyond an hour. So yeah, let me just catch up on some of the comments. So yeah, CSS Tricks is great, says Ibrahim. I agree. It's an incredible resource for just learning new things about CSS. You will have noticed in the further reading from last week that there were 2 URLs, one for Flexbox and one for CSS Grid, and they were both from CSS Tricks, and they're incredible resources. So I believe what you said about CSS is also true of every other technology. No course or tutorial can cover everything, but open up your favorite code editor and learn as you go. Yep, no, I agree. Aruthran, this has been the best of all lessons so far. Good job. Thank you. I appreciate that. It's definitely been the most interesting, I know. Axis, thank you. I appreciate that. Ibrahim, disclaimer does not work for heart surgery. I don't know. Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. I didn't understand that, but now I do in relation to everything else. So a few people saying thank you. No, I thank you for being present. I really appreciate it. And before we go, does anyone have any questions or anything that they want me to answer now? Yeah, you can all still say thanks. Oh, and for anyone who's still here, as you know, it helps so much when you talk about this on Twitter, whether it's sharing screen grabs like I know some of you have done and so on. If you can, where possible, make sure you tag Stackademic HQ in there, and feel free to also tag me as well, because that also helps. Okay, well, I'm guessing there are no additional questions or follow-up questions. If not, then actually, okay. We've got a couple of things. So, Ax, yeah, feel free to speak.
Hey, Sunil.
Hey.
Yeah, so I was wondering whether if you could quickly take a look at the site that I cobbled together. It's not complete yet, but I couldn't quite get the flex to work in the way that I thought it should. So, I mean, yeah, so disclaimer, is not finished yet the way that I'd envisioned, like I said. But yeah, my question is about the flex. So I had put in a flex I was expecting the rows to collapse into columns once the site was reduced to a particular width, or the viewport was reduced to a particular width. But it doesn't seem to do that. I don't know why.
Okay. Well, yeah, we can certainly take a look at it. I can do it now as well. Have you got the link handy so I can copy and paste it?
The GitHub link?
Yes, if you've got it close by, otherwise I'll have to try and find it.
I don't have it close by. I can bring it up in just a second.
Okay, yeah, if you do that, and then I'll just catch up on some of the comments in the meantime. So Ruthran says, why is the attendance lower? So to be honest with you, I'm not entirely sure, because we've got lots of students enrolled. I have a feeling that it's because of the time zone differences. As you'll know, we've students in over 70 countries, and therefore there are lots of different time zones. So it's likely just a case that people are not able to attend at this time. Yeah, as Alexi points out as well, that there are big time zone differences. So these are things that that will change from time to time. We might. I know Piero is looking to do the class 1 hour later. I imagine that's going to affect some people in good and bad ways. And then, it may be that when I return to teaching, maybe we'll do it on a different day completely, maybe a weekend or something like that. So we'll see. And then Hafiz says, is it possible that we get to know the class that you, wait, is it? Hafiz, I'm not quite sure I understand. Do you mean, is it possible to find out the content before the class starts?
Exactly that. What are we going to study in this specific
okay.
lecture? So that because today what we have studied here, I didn't know anything about it. Maybe if I knew it 2 days ago, I would have gone through something on the internet, so that I have a little knowledge about it beforehand. Even though I know I cannot grasp all the things, but yeah, a little knowledge, so that when I'm listening to you, I get something.
Okay, no, that's a fair point. It's definitely something that that we're going to try to introduce as well. One thing by the way, Axe, I'm loading up your website in the background. So one thing to bear in mind is, ultimately I agree. But because this is the very first cohort, and we're still kind of building things as we go along, it sometimes makes it a little bit difficult for us to give you all of the information that you'll need ahead of time. Whereas, say, in the second cohort for the future students, chances are we'll already have a lot of this information. So it'll be easy for us to let students know ahead of time. One thing I do know, though, is that Piero is in the process of planning quite a few of the lessons in advance. And because there is a gap between when this module ends and that one starts, hopefully he'll be able to give you a bit more information as to what happens, what you're going to teach. Oh, sorry, what you're going to learn, I should say. Right, let me switch to this code pen. By the way, I hope that answers your question, Hafiz. So in the future, we'll definitely be giving you more information ahead of time.
No worries. It was just a suggestion, but yeah, no worries.
Cool. So, right, let's see. Can you see the website? Okay, so bear in mind that the images aren't loaded. That's just because they're not in this code pen. But hopefully we can still at least see what it is that you're referring to. In fact, maybe I can just throw some random image in there. Let me see the homework again. Okay, let me just grab some random image. Okay. Right, okay. Now these images aren't going to be the exact same dimensions as what you had before, Axe, but
yeah, I don't think that should matter, honestly, because I don't think I've not specified the image dimension anywhere. I think I had a max width of 33% or 32% on the images so that they wouldn't create a horizontal scroll.
okay. So let's take a look. Just to answer your question, Simran, there's not a strict deadline, but ideally, you should have all of the homework that we've given you so far completed by the end of March. So if you can get this out of the way before starting the JavaScript homework, the JavaScript module, because that homework's going to be going to require a lot more of your concentration, and you'll potentially be working in groups as well. So it's important to get this individual homework out of the way. So tell me, Axe, from what you can see on the screen at the moment, what in your opinion doesn't look right? Is it a case of you want this information here to be as a column rather than a row?
It's not that I wanted it as a column, as a row. No, I did want it as a row, but I was expecting it to collapse into a column because I thought that's what Flex was supposed to do.
Okay, I get you.
To reduce the report to like something like 400 pixels or something like that, smaller than the image size, for example.
Okay, I understand. So right, okay, yeah, because by the looks of it, it looks like you're doing the right things. I have a feeling it's because of the max width that you've put on the image and the p tag inside of this flex row content. Because I think when you put the max width of 33%, it's just scaling down. It's always going to be 33% of 100, which of course 33 times 3 is 99, which fits into 100. So as it shrinks, so do the elements. Whereas if we take them off, so I've taken max width off it. I know you can't see the developer tools, but I've taken it off now, and then they do that. So let's
collapse, right? Okay.
But then, okay, so let me see something. So flex row. Okay, yeah. So you've got flow wrap. So row wrap. We'll put that back on. Okay, so if for this P we do, in fact, let's put the width back on the P tag. So we've got the width on the P tag. Let me see if these. Okay, so right, I understand what's going on, and I can see why that would have been confusing. So the reason why, annoyingly, wait, actually, do you know what? I think you will be able to see the developer tools now, because just give me one moment. Let me reshare the application window instead. And you should be able to. Okay, yeah, so you can see developer tools as well now, can't you? So what's happening is the styles that you've put here are fine. You've done everything right there. You've got it as a row. You're telling it to wrap over. So that's fine. What happens is I've taken the max width off of there. So I know I've explained that, and I know you understand that bit. So that's cool. Whereas if I take it off of the P or the paragraph tag, everything just appears as a column, even though this doesn't have a width on it anymore. These are, and the reason is because the images are inline elements, whereas a paragraph, paragraph's a block. So it fills the entire width unless you tell it otherwise. So that's why if we put this max width back onto the P, then we're saying, okay, I want you to, I'm effectively saying, I want you to almost act like an inline element again. So then when we have it on there, these images are just 200 by 300 pixels. So they're not going to rescale or anything. So as we reduce the size, eventually it's going to get to a point where there's an overlap, and then they start to do what you anticipated they would.
Right.
So, you know, what you could do is maybe as it gets to that point where it's about to spill over, that might be where you have a media query that just says, okay, I want everything to appear as a column, so that you don't end up in a situation where you've got two elements on one row and one element on the second row. So does that make sense to you now?
Oh, yeah, that makes way more sense than it did 10 minutes ago.
Awesome. I'm glad to hear it. And the thing is, like, even as I'm going through it, I have to remember in those moments, like, oh yeah, of course, P tags are block elements. Yeah, it's just one of those things. I mean, the more and more you do it, you'll get used to it. I know you will anyway. So yeah, all good. Was there anything else you wanted to know about the website or anything else at all?
No, thank you very much. That was helpful. Thanks.
Awesome. Okay, that's good. I'm glad to hear it. By the way, Axe, out of interest, whilst I've got you, in normal situations, what time do you go to bed? Because it must be pretty late for you.
Yeah, I think after lockdown started, I kind of staying up late, and I haven't switched back to normal hours, and because most work is fairly flexible. I tend to wake up late and sleep late. So.
Fair enough. No, just because I notice sometimes you'll respond to things on Twitter, and I'm thinking, wow, I'm surely it must be like 2 or 3 in the morning where you are.
Yeah, well, the other thing is my wife and I are unwillingly separated. She's in the UK. I'm in India. She was planning to move to India in June of last year, but well, 2020. So we're still trying to figure out how to get together. And,
of course.
So whenever she calls, it's fairly late in the day anyway, because by the time she gets free, it's evening there. So yeah, that's the long and short of it.
No, fair enough. I better stop the recording anyway now, because just so we're not talking about your personal